anti-Semitism raged across the world, including on America's college campuses. This committee moved swiftly to investigate this spike in hate by holding a hearing just a few weeks after the attack. Over the last 8 months, Americans have seen how the inaction of university leaders embolden anti-Israel, anti-Jew, and anti-American radicals on college campuses. That inaction resulted in encampments springing up at many of America's so-called elite universities and brought education at those institutions to a grinding halt. Students, faculty, and outside agitators stormed campus buildings and blocked entrances. Classes were disrupted or moved online. Long-awaited graduation ceremonies were canceled. Following this committee's hearing in November, we launched an investigation into several universities regarding their handling of violence and harassment of Jewish students on their campuses. The universities under investigation all failed to root out anti-Semitism and protect Jewish students on their campuses. The committee continues to receive evidence and first-hand accounts that schools are ignoring the concerns of Jewish students, failing to enforce campus policies, and refusing to discipline students found to have violated university rules and codes of conduct. Just a few examples of such failures include the failure of MIT to discipline students who violated campus policies simply because they were not Americans and were here on student visas. The failure of Harvard to listen to the recommendations of its anti-Semitism advisory group, even though the committee identified ways Jewish students were being harassed. The failure of Cornell to enforce real discipline on campus agitators who violated campus policies by repeatedly disrupting basic educational functions, including class and exams. The failure of Penn to take meaningful disciplinary action against students and faculty who violated campus policies, including one student who stole an Israeli flag from a campus apartment and the Faculty for Justice in Palestine blocking the entrance to campus. The committee's investigation has identified 3 key areas of concern. First is the fact that weak university leadership has repeatedly failed to protect students and focus on its actual mission of educating students. Second is the role that radical faculty are playing in fueling and in some cases taking part in violations of campus policy and law, on top of teaching concepts that fuel anti-Semitism and hatred. Lastly, there's the role that international students are playing in anti-Semitic and dangerous protest on college campuses across the country. Our investigation continues, but based on the evidence already gathered, we can easily see that many universities are failing their students by turning a blind eye to anti-Semitism. Instead, they are caving to the demands of loud, hateful, and destructive detractors, often to the detriment of student safety, coursework, class time, and academic success on campus. That is no way to fulfill an educational mission. I'm glad that Speaker Johnson called for a collective House investigation to bolster this committee's effort that started in November. House Republicans will continue to press universities to fulfill their tax-exempt purpose by changing course to regain control of campuses. To the universities listening, if you think we will lose focus, interest, or forget about this, you couldn't be more wrong. We will continue to use the tools of the Ways and Means Committee to protect Americans on college campuses from danger until university administrators grow a spine and start doing their job. I want to thank each of our witnesses for being here, and I look forward to learning more about what is occurring on college campuses today and how the situation has evolved since the hearing in November. I'm pleased to recognize Ranking Member Nill for his opening statement.
Thank you. I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning, and especially a warm welcome to our former colleague and my friend, former Congressman Ted Deutch. And congratulations to Talia for her graduation as well. At the outset, I think it's fair to say that we all condemn anti-Semitism. Since our last hearing, we are saddened that the hateful actions and rhetoric that has too often targeted Jewish students has continued. These incidents have disrupted campuses, leaving too many questioning safety. Universities certainly have a responsibility to cultivate safe and supportive learning environments. And today, we're going to hear what has happened in the spring and consider recommendations to combat anti-Semitism on campuses this fall. Some of today's witnesses may blame campus anti-Semitism on DEI programs. I do not agree. Celebrating and learning from our differences is how we become a more inclusive nation while combating some of the biggest threats. The idea here should remain part of the universal form called unity without uniformity. The Biden administration has been hard at work to help our campuses, announcing multiple actions to address reported anti-Semitic incidents at our schools and our college campuses, including the role of DHS and DOJ as they engage with state, local, and campus law enforcement. The administration has also updated the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights Discrimination Complaints to process and specify that there are certain forms of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that are prohibited under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Our universities, I anticipate, will take the summer to prepare for what comes next. Americans are counting on the continuation of free thought and at the same time the safety of students on our college campuses. We need to meet the moment with great care, thoughtfulness, and vigilance. Fighting anti-Semitism, and indeed all hate, should remain our priority. Not to miss the point that there was ugly strains of religious bigotry throughout American history, including the role that the Know-Nothings played in opposition to immigration more than a century ago. Denouncing bigotry in all forms is an American value, and that's one that we must carry forward from here today. Let me yield the balance of my time to a gentleman who's exhibited, I think, great sound temperament and advice to the committee, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Ranking Member Nill, and welcome. I'll take the privilege to also welcome my dear friend, former colleague Ted Deutch, and make note of the piece of tape on your lapel that says 251 days since the hostages were captured. And to Talia, I extend congratulations to you and your family on graduation. Graduation from Columbia, which has been at the center of much of what we are talking about today. And it's not surprising. It's not something that happened overnight at Columbia. It's an issue that has festered there for a very long time, but was accelerated following October 7th. And we'll talk more about that today. What should every young person be able to rightly expect when attending college or university, often leaving the safety of their home communities for the first time? To be educated, to learn the lessons and skills to prepare for a successful, fulfilling career in life. To be intellectually challenged, including having some of their core beliefs, their most closely held truths, proven wrong. But also to be safe in their person, in their spirit, in their ability to learn and grow, to step out of their comfort zones and expand their horizons. What we have seen on campuses across the country since October 7th is an explosion of anti-Semitism, often in its most vile forms, specifically targeting Jewish students under the guise of anti-Israel or anti-Zionist protest. According to the ADL, we saw a nearly 400% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in just the first few months after October 7th. And the rate only accelerated in the spring as the weather improved and the protesters moved to occupy campuses. To be clear, being anti-Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitic, any more than being opposed to the policies of any other country or government. However, delegitimizing Jews' aspiration for a state in their national homeland, a land in which Jews have continuously lived for 3,500 years is absolutely anti-Semitism. Excluding Jewish, Israeli, and pro-Israeli students from classrooms, public spaces, and organizational activities on campus is anti-Semitism. Vandalizing the homes, offices, or rooms of Jewish administrators, faculties, or students is anti-Semitism. Our colleges and universities should be safe places for learning and growth, not hotbeds of hate and discrimination. Too many Jewish students on campus have been targeted as individuals and collectively. This is not about free speech. I will defend everyone's right to stand at the Rock at Northwestern or Harvard Yard or the Quad or the center of any school and express their views. But when speech crosses over into hate, to intimidation, to exclusion or isolation, it is imperative that school leaders, including university presidents, but also faculty and even student governments and student leaders, recognize that hate has no place on their campus. Every student, irrespective of religion, nationality, or ideology, must feel safe, and we expect our universities to ensure that they do. I yield back.
Thank you. Before I begin, I want to take a moment and acknowledge Dr. Murphy and also Mr. Evans, both valued members of our committee that are not with us because they're both recovering from treatments and procedures. And we'll continue to keep them in our prayers, and we look forward to both of them coming back to our committee very soon. I will now introduce our witnesses. One of the witnesses from our November hearing, Ms. Talia Dror, is back today to update us on how the environment on her college campus, Cornell University, has worsened. To her credit, despite the sad circumstances on campus, she graduated college a few weeks ago. And on behalf of the entire committee, I'd like to extend our congratulations and welcome you back. We have Professor Shai Davidai.
Shai Davidai.
Shai Davidai. Is that, well, it's closer.
Like the adjective,
I'm going to
shy.
call you Professor. Professor. He's an assistant professor of business at Columbia Business School. We have Dr. Jonathan Pidluzny, is director of higher education reform at America First Policy Institute. We have the Honorable Kenneth L. Marcus, is founder and chairman at Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights under Law. And we have the Honorable and former colleague, Mr. Ted Deutch. Welcome back to the House. He's the Chief Executive Officer at American Jewish Community. Thank you all for joining us today. Your written statements will be made part of the hearing record, and you each have 5 minutes to deliver your remarks. Mr. R., you may begin when you are ready.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the Ways and Means Committee. Thank you for inviting me back to testify today. My name is Talia Dror. I'm a recent graduate of Cornell University. 7 months ago, I described how directly after the October 7th attacks, my campus erupted in celebration. I explained how the anti-Semitic environment fostered by pro-Hamas students, professors, and administrators led to a Cornell student threatening to bomb our kosher dining hall and slaughter every Jew on our campus. I am here today to tell you that since then, blatant violations of Cornell's code of conduct continue, appeased and rewarded by my university. Now, these violations have been exposed for what they truly are, expressions not just of Jew hatred, but of a burning hatred for the United States itself. In December, students occupied our main building, vandalizing it with genocidal slogans and hoisting a Palestinian flag on an American flagpole. In January, student protesters chanted, "Houthis, Houthis, make us proud, turn another ship around." The Houthis are a US-designated terrorist organization whose slogan reads, quote, "God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse on the Jews, victory to Islam." Throughout the month of February, protesters held weekly die-ins. I was in the library during the first die-in. I watched as hundreds of masked students lay on the floor and began chanting anti-Semitic slogans. As I watched alongside visibly disturbed students, I saw an administrator just standing there and watching, doing nothing to enforce Cornell's policies. A Jewish freshman who was studying there recognized me and began sobbing in my arms. As I held this girl, whose name I did not even know, I realized the gravity of the moment. Cornell's administration has made a decision to protect hateful radicals at the expense of everyone else. In the following weeks, Cornell's policy of appeasement resulted in classes constantly being canceled and exams needing to be moved as the pro-Hamas group wreaked havoc. Anti-American students stifle intellectual disagreement by threatening anyone who does not conform to their orthodoxy. On March 3rd, a Jewish student was accosted by a fellow student who approached her and yelled, "Effing Zionist scum. Yeah, I've seen you around, genocidaire. God forbid a Zionist feel unsafe." The university's investigation has been open for over 3 months now with no resolution in sight. On March 29th, a member of Cornell's student government refused to allow pro-Hamas students to break election rules. That night, a student told him that he better watch his back and that he would regret ever joining the student assembly. This should come as no surprise, as the administration not only allows these incidents to occur, it promotes the anti-Semitic ideology fueling them. As part of their education series on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, the university sponsored a lecture by Sahar Aziz, who's currently being investigated by both the US House and Senate for espousing vile anti-Semitic propaganda. Cornell has also platformed a vocal pro-Hamas student who referred to Jewish students as, quote, bloodthirsty Zionists only satiated by the blood of Palestinians, and claims that he does not take his cue from the Cornell Student Assembly, but rather from the armed resistance in Palestine, referring to Hamas. Next year, this student will be teaching an introductory course for incoming freshmen. On April 25th, Cornell students formed an encampment, blatantly violating the code of conduct. Encampers chanted phrases like "there is only one solution, Intifada revolution," a call to kill Jews worldwide. 3 weeks later, when the encampment was dismantled, the university issued a statement expressing gratitude that the students terrorizing campus somehow restrained themselves from physically carrying out their violent sentiments. All the administration had to do was enforce its existing rules. Instead, it chose to negotiate with the protesters, grant them immunity, and thank them for their self-restraint. The message was very clear. Rules are meaningless, and lawlessness is rewarded. Let me be very clear. The hostile environment I have just described to you pervades campuses all across the country, from Harvard to UC Santa Barbara, from UCLA to Yale. American universities have allowed themselves to be controlled by vicious chants, rule-breaking, and anarchy. If they wish to continue benefiting from government funding, they must start upholding American values rather than bowing to those who wish to see this country burn. My tuition has subsidized the indoctrination of a generation that hates our country. It would be a disgrace for even one more taxpayer dollar to do the same. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Professor Davidai, you are now recognized.
My name is Shai Davidai. I'm an assistant professor at Columbia Business School. Since October 7th, when Hamas raped, tortured, slaughtered, and kidnapped more than 1,400 of my people, Columbia's campus has been a hostile environment for Jews and Israelis like me. Over the past months, Jewish students have locked themselves in dorms to avoid being assaulted. They have been spat on, attacked, bullied, vilified, chased, and told to keep effing running. This is not an exaggeration. This is the reality of what it's like being Jewish and Israeli at Columbia since October 7th. For more than 8 months, Columbia University has refused to deal with the student organizations whose leaders and members have, among other things, publicly supported Hamas, the PFLP, and the Islamic Jihad, illegally occupied public spaces on campus from which they denied entry to Jewish and Israeli students, violently took over a university building and held an employee hostage against his will, chanted in support of the Houthis, a terrorist organization whose flag calls for death to Israel, death to America, and a curse upon the Jews, called for the extermination of Israel, called for Zionists to be killed, called for rockets to be shot at Tel Aviv, supported the Islamic Republic of Iran in its attack on Israeli civilian targets, harassed a rabbi who was escorting Jewish students to safety, hosted the wife of a man convicted of providing material support to Hamas, amplified calls by Hamas for violence in Jerusalem, set up memorials for convicted terrorists on campus, called on the military wing of Hamas to attack Jewish American students, and invited speakers with known ties to terrorist organizations to an event in support of terrorism. Everything I've just noted is well documented and known to the university leaders, yet there are two Columbias, a Columbia in theory and a Columbia in practice. In theory, Columbia suspended two organizations and a handful of their leaders for their pro-terror activity. In practice, these suspensions were never enforced and they continue to organize on campus without interruptions. In theory, Columbia has stated that pro-terror campus protests are unauthorized. In practice, the university has never dispersed even a single protest. In theory, Columbia cares about the safety of its Jewish and Israeli students. In practice, it doesn't. Minu Shafiq, Jerry Rosberg, Cass Holloway, and Felice Rozan have all personally allowed these organizations to terrorize Jewish and Israeli students with complete impunity. They must be held accountable. Yet these individuals are just the tip of the iceberg. We must hold accountable the entire administration and the Board of Trustees. We must hold accountable the faculty who openly support and celebrate terrorism. Professor Joseph Massad, who expressed his jubilation and awe at the massacre, rape, torture, and kidnapping of Israeli civilians. Professor Mohammed Abdu, who openly supports terrorism, stating that he is with the resistance, be it Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Islamic Jihad. Professor Catherine Frank, who has justified terrorist attacks against Israel and has claimed that Israelis are a danger on campus. Professor Rashid Khalidi, who was reportedly the spokesperson for the PLO when it was still an active terrorist organization and who has legitimized Hamas and Islamic Jihad as resistance fighters. Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, who has called for the dismantling of the Jewish state, and Professors Asim Ansari and Kamal Jadidi of Columbia Business School, who, along with many other professors, signed a letter minimizing the massacre, rape, and kidnapping of civilians as merely a military response. These professors receive millions of dollars in federal funding for their research and teaching. These professors teach the next generation of American doctors, lawyers, teachers, leaders, and social workers. These are the professors with whom American parents entrust their kids' safety. This is why I'm here. I'm here to speak up for every decent American who believes that anti-Semitism and support for terrorism have no place on campus. I am here to speak up for every person, Jewish or non-Jewish, who believes that rape is never, never, never okay. I am here to speak up for the future of higher education. Yes, I paid a personal price for speaking up, but I would rather pay the price for speaking up than the price for staying silent. Let me be clear, this is not about politics. The terrorists who kidnapped Keith Siegel, an American from North Carolina, did not stop to ask him who he voted for in the previous elections. The professors who called the kidnapping of Omer Nutra, an American from Long Island, a military response, do not care about his geopolitics. The students who desecrate pictures of Hersh Goldberg Polin, an American who had his arm blown off before being kidnapped into Gaza, do not care about his views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is not about politics. This is about hate. Hate for Israel, hate for the Jewish people's right for self-determination, and hate for America and all that it stands for. Like the US Congress, I and many others have been asleep at the wheel for too long. It is time to take action. It is time to wake up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Pidluzny, you are now recognized.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. It's a real privilege. I direct the Higher Education Reform Initiative at the America First Policy Institute. Prior to joining AFPI, I was Vice President of Academic Affairs at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. I began my career on a public university campus and spent 10 great years teaching political science in Kentucky. What's happened on US campuses since the Hamas massacre should shake us to the core. It's not just that the hatred is deep in the places where we train tomorrow's leaders, university administrators have reacted to violent displays of anti-Semitism with indifference to their Jewish students' well-being. Perhaps most surprising of all, the worst of the violence and harassment has occurred at the country's wealthiest and its most prestigious institutions. This matters for many reasons, not least because our elite universities shape the broader public culture. What happens on campus today will radiate through American society, reshaping attitudes for years to come. With my time today, I'd like to explore some of the reasons I think the hatred is most pronounced at elite universities. There are three main drivers of campus anti-Semitism in my view: anti-Zionist faculty, radical students and the pro-Hamas student groups they lead, and the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that now suffuse higher education. I'd like to focus on DEI because it's the atmospheric cause, the ideas in the air that dispose young people to find anti-Semitic faculty and students so compelling. DEI is not about ensuring that underprepared students have the support they need to succeed in educational programs that promise a high return on investment. Universities should actually be doing more of that. DEI's real priorities are drawn from critical race theory. The goal is to use the university to re-engineer American society away from its aspirational ideals, equality before the law, equal treatment according to individual merit. Instead, DEI pushes relentlessly for equity, equal outcomes, and to dismantle, quote, systemic oppression by making race and identity central to everything we do and everything we think. As such, DEI teaches that the world is made up of oppressors and the oppressed, victims and those with privilege. This divisive ideology primes students to make snap judgments about each other based on skin color and identity group stereotypes. Jews are coded as the oppressors by virtue of their political and economic success. This is what creates a kind of permission structure for students to join in with the true radicals cheering for the Hamas terrorists who deliberately kill children and rape hostages. Major universities spend tens of millions of dollars each year on DEI, and their armies number in the hundreds. This helps to explain why anti-Semitism is more pronounced on elite campuses. They have been funding what drives it for over a decade. 4 points in closing will give perspective on how this relates to higher education finance. First, of the 12 wealthiest private universities by endowment value, 11 had anti-Semitic encampments or arrests. In 2022, Harvard's endowment hit $53 billion. Columbia's topped 14. The 300 private schools with endowments valued at more than $100,000 per student together control well over $500 billion, war chests that receive supremely favorable tax treatment. Second, elite universities receive billions in federal grants and contracts every year. To be sure, these programs fund important research, but universities also receive indirect cost reimbursements as high as 69% on top of the programs funded. That's unrestricted revenue that can be spent on other priorities. In 2022, Columbia took in $1.2 billion in federal grants and contracts, and again, all but one of the top 12 private university recipients of federal grants saw anti-Semitic arrests or encampments this spring. Third, foreign money has been flowing to elite universities for decades. In recent years, the sums have been enormous. For example, $1.8 billion since 2014 for Cornell, and that's just from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Last, elite universities enroll thousands of foreign students who generally pay full freight. It only takes a small number to spark violent and menacing protests. Our analysis revealed that out of the 111 universities with anti-Semitic encampments and/or arrests this year, 20 have student bodies consisting of more than 20% foreign students. 13 campuses surpass 25%. In conclusion, the spasms of hate that have convulsed elite universities demonstrate that existing accountability structures are insufficient. Immense public investment in higher education rightly makes this an important subject for congressional oversight. It also gives the Congress several powerful policy levers to effect positive change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marcus.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, distinguished members of the committee, Thank you for inviting me to join you. I'm Kenneth L. Marcus, chairman of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law and former Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights. Over the last 20 years, I have been fighting anti-Semitism on college campuses, but never seen anything like what we have experienced since October 7. Even in the year prior to October 7, we saw record levels of anti-Semitism on college campuses. In the 3 weeks following October 7, we saw as many incidents reported to us as in the prior record-breaking year. Over the time since then, and in particular since this committee had its last hearing, what we have seen is a spreading of the extreme and violent situation on a handful of campuses throughout this country. While there are elite institutions such as Harvard and Berkeley that have been in the news, the fact is that we are seeing problems even at institutions that had previously seen none of them. We are seeing a kind of perfect storm of student violent extremism, professorial politicization, undisclosed foreign funding, and often feckless and weak administration. This is happening all over the country to the extent that I would say it is a crisis that needs to be dealt with. Most of these institutions are tax exempt and need to be held accountable if they do not meet the requirements of their tax exempt status. That's true of the universities and also of some of the organizations that have been fomenting hatred. My former agency, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, has a central role in addressing this campus anti-Semitism. During this administration, they have done some things right. The national strategy from the White House raised awareness of the issue. There has been transparency and also, I would say, a number of cases opened, some of them in a timely manner. At the same time, we've seen no significant policy advances. We've seen extremely slow enforcement of campus anti-Semitism cases. We've seen tools available to the agency that are not being used, such as the possibility of proactive compliance reviews, proactive agency-directed investigations, the possibility of joint investigations by OCR and the Department of Justice, which has been used in prior administrations and could be used here. Lots of different tools that are available that aren't being used, and we'd like to see that changed. Beyond that, we have seen good cases being dismissed in ways that appear to deviate from the law. For example, cases that are being dismissed under Rule 110H of the OCR manual, which allows dismissal in some class actions, but which has been used for dismissals in some non-class action cases. In other words, we are not seeing the sort of enforcement that we would like to see. In fairness, the Education Department doesn't have all of the tools that it could use. While it does have the ability to deny all federal funds to an institution, that is a remedy that is not necessarily sufficient because it is used so rarely, if ever at all. It would certainly be helpful if additional remedies were available to address recalcitrant institutions that permitted hostile environments. This House of Representatives did good work when it passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. The fact is that one of the greatest problems for universities and also for the federal government is an inability to determine when incidents can be considered anti-Semitism and when they aren't. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, if enacted into law, would be a big step. But there are other problems that are still unaddressed. One of the most disturbing problems that we have seen is that when Jewish students try to report anti-Semitism through university grievance programs, they often face retaliation. They are often accused of other sorts of incidents, and those accusations are taken seriously. Retaliatory claims and counterclaims have to be addressed as well. Beyond that, we need to look at joint compliance, national initiatives, and investigation into those groups that have at least the appearance of potentially advancing terrorism. Any university that has a student organization that has indicated a potential support for terrorism should be investigating it, and to the extent that isn't happening, it should be done by the United States federal government. Given the importance of tax-exempt status for institutions that receive it, I think that it is entirely welcome that this committee is looking into this issue and that there is room for strengthening the protections that we have for our students. I thank this committee for its attention and thank you for including me in this hearing.
Thank you. Congressman Deutch, you're recognized.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, members of the committee. It's an honor to be before you to testify in this body where I served alongside many of you for 7 terms. Today I'm here in my capacity as CEO of American Jewish Committee on the heels of our global forum where 2,000 Jewish leaders, including hundreds of young leaders from around the world, convened. And what's happening on university campuses in the United States is the threat that everyone from all of the 55 countries represented expects us to confront, because our Jewish students and faculty are on the front lines of the battle against dangerous anti-Semitism. Protests in the weeks after 10/7 featured students and faculty celebrating terror, unapologetically declaring Hamas's barbarity to be exhilarating and glorious and liberating. Over winter break, the Jewish community held its collective breath, hoping the temperature would be turned down on college campuses. Instead, we witnessed a doubling down in the spring, as Talia and Shai both spoke powerfully too. Radical anti-Israel protesters commandeered campus quads, occupied university buildings, fomenting vile anti-Semitic messaging, and creating an atmosphere of harassment, intimidation, and fear for Jewish students, faculty, and staff, and disrupting normal campus activities for all campus citizens, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. Students have been forced to walk a gauntlet on college campuses, finding alternative pathways to classes, dining halls, libraries, just to stay safe. They have watched as campus events featuring Israeli speakers were canceled or moved to secret, out-of-the-way hiding spots. And they've had classes moved online because it was no longer safe for them to be on campus. And the response of many university presidents and chancellors to these events has been woefully inadequate and completely lacking in leadership. Jewish life on campus became narrowed, relegated to dark corners, while lawless protesters took center stage and were allowed to remain there, despite pushing past every margin of acceptable conduct. In some cases, these radical individuals were granted a seat at the table with university boards as a reward for their blatant disregard of the rules. It should not come as a surprise that this school year shook to the core the Jewish community's trust in institutions of higher learning. University leaders must use these summer months to confront this problem that risks permanently staining the reputations of our country's top academic institutions. And they must disabuse themselves of the notion that everything will return to normal in the coming year. Accepting anti-Semitism as normal is what helped get us to this place. And the news from just the past few days confirms that the threats to the Jewish community are increasing, and we know that colleges are not immune. Last weekend, down the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue near the White House, protesters held signs, screamed and defaced statues with "Stand with Hamas," "Kill another Zionist now," calls for jihad, and "Death to America." On Monday in New York, a mob celebrated the Hamas murder of over 360 people at the Nova Music Festival. On Tuesday, a mass group boarded a New York subway car and shouted, "Raise your hands if you're a Zionist." Masked people on a subway asking, "Raise your hand if you're a Zionist. This is your chance to get out." And also this week, homes of Jewish employees and leadership of the Brooklyn Museum were vandalized with signs saying "white supremacist, Zionist." Every member of this committee should be sickened by this. Every member of this committee should say so publicly. This anti-Semitic and anti-American incitement to violence can no longer be tolerated. It must be stopped before it leads to real violence. Is it any wonder that AJC's most recent state of anti-Semitism in America shows that 78% of American Jews feel less safe since the attacks of 10/7? In our work with administrators and included in our toolkit for university leadership, AJC emphasizes initiatives to address anti-Semitism head-on so that it doesn't become permanent, which it will unless we assertively counter it with strong, coordinated, and multi-pronged approach. With this in mind, we recommend that schools update their codes of conduct and actually enforce their own rules, include anti-Semitism education and training for their entire communities, return to centers of fact-based exchange, ensure the physical safety of Jewish students, and university presidents should announce that they will open Title VI compliance offices, much like they have Title IX offices. The House has passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, And I encourage you to support and pass the Countering Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which would help strengthen federal efforts to counter anti-Semitism, including higher education. There are students in your districts being told that their identity as Jews and Zionists is putting their safety at risk. Listen to them. Use your important role as a member of the U.S. House to help them. In closing, please remember, anti-Semitism is not just a threat to the Jewish community. It's a threat to our democracy. This moment is not just about anti-Semitism, it's about the society that we want to live in. We must hold schools accountable. We must protect all students, and we must work together in a bipartisan fashion and declare zero tolerance for anti-Semitism. We have seen throughout the history of the Jewish people where anti-Semitism can lead. Now is the time. Act with the urgency this moment demands. Thank you for inviting me back to the House for this very important hearing.
Thank you for your testimony. We'll now move to questions. Ms. Dror, you testified before our committee during the past fall semester about your experience with violent threats and harassment and other anti-Semitic behavior on Cornell's campus. You recalled being terrified, knowing that as an outspoken Jewish leader, you could likely be identified and targeted by anyone seeking to do harm. Did you feel the same way during the spring semester that just completed?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thankfully, there were no more expressed death threats against Jewish students this semester, but watching the widespread acceptance and normalization of anti-Semitism kind of created a different type of fear in me. Watching myself and fellow Jewish students begin to develop an "it could be worse" mentality. We could be getting stabbed in the eye like my friend Sahar at Yale did, or be told that we deserve to go back to Poland like my friend Shai did. I began to realize how dangerous it is to become desensitized to this form of bigotry and hatred.
Professor Davidai, many of us here have heard about what happened on Columbia University's campus this spring. I'm happy that you are here with us today. So can we hear firsthand from a member of the faculty about what has been going on at Columbia, including the unauthorized encampment, which resulted in police arresting over 100 Columbia students. What do you think are the main factors that led students to feel emboldened to essentially take over Columbia's campus?
Thank you so much. That's a great question. I would say that there are two main factors. One is a complete lack of leadership and accountability from the administration. The student organizations and their leaders have seen that they can do whatever they want with complete impunity, that when they break the laws, the university will send out a strong email but will not follow it. When they get suspended, nothing actually is enforced, that they can hold unauthorized protests and won't be dispersed, that they can basically spew out hate, anti-Semitism, and pro-terror rhetoric, and nothing will happen to them. And the second factor is the faculty. There have been many faculty who've not only indoctrinated these students and egged them on to keep going, like Professor Catherine Frank, but many faculty who actually defended with their bodies to stop police enforcement of the illegal encampment. So when you have a mixture of pro-Hamas, pro-Islamic Jihad faculty and an administration that shows no leadership and no accountability, that's what you get.
So I think it's safe to say, based on your answer there, that Columbia has not been living up to its obligations to its students and fulfilling its educational purpose.
I would say that it didn't even pretend to live up. It's not that Columbia can't, it's that Columbia won't.
Columbia won't. And the professors you listed in your opening statement, that's extremely disturbing. Thank you. Mr. Marcus, part of today's hearing is to see what, if anything, Congress can or should do to hold schools accountable and protect students on campus. For For this committee, that includes considering whether colleges and universities are complying with Section 501 of the Internal Revenue Code and fulfilling their tax-exempt purpose. For our committees, that may mean, for other committees, that also may mean looking at Title VI and the Department of Education's process for resolving these types of complaints. Based on your experience, do you think it would be helpful if federal agencies had additional tools to use when investigating colleges and universities for alleged violations of anti-discrimination laws? And are there any policy solutions Congress should consider?
Yes, Chairman Smith, thank you. I do think that additional remedies are necessary. There is the possibility of lawsuits, but those are expensive and lengthy. The current process at OCR is also somewhat cumbersome and seldom leads to the sort of resolution that really would require fundamental change, nor is the OCR system necessarily built for the sort of crisis that we have today. So for those institutions that are recalcitrant in the face of growing anti-Semitism to which they have shown something like deliberate indifference, I think a more streamlined, quicker process that could lead to issues with respect to tax-exempt status would be a welcome addition to the remedies that are now at play.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Nill, for questions.
Thank you. Mr. Deutch, give you a chance to answer the same questions that were just offered to Mr. Marcus, and give you an opportunity to discuss safety on campus, what suggestions you would make to take action against anti-Semitism beyond the universal condemnation that you've heard. And perhaps you could talk a bit about your recommendations for integrating anti-Semitism training in many of our institutions.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal. First of all, in response to the question about what can Congress do, the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education needs additional resources. The challenges that we've all described are so great. We want and expect the Office of Civil Rights to take necessary action, to begin investigations promptly, and most importantly, to complete them promptly so that accountability can actually be brought to bear. They need additional resources so that they can do that. I mentioned as well the Countering Anti-Semitism Act. There are two ways to address anti-Semitism. One is to identify it, and Congress passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act because identifying anti-Semitism is important. That's what the IRA definition does. It's why AJC's worked to pass it so many places around the world and around the United States, and it's what that bill does, and I hope that the Senate will pass that as well. The Countering Anti-Semitism Act strengthens federal efforts beyond that. Once we've identified anti-Semitism, we should have greater resources. There should be someone in the White House going forward in every administration that's focused on this issue. Same at the Department of Education. That's what that bill, H.R. 7921, does, and I encourage members to look at it, to co-sponsor it, and ultimately, I hope the Speaker will bring it up so that it can pass. In terms of safety on campus, there are different steps that the universities can take, but first and foremost, and I think we all agree, and we've heard different versions of this, the campus administration has to enforce its own rules. The code of conduct on its campus has to be updated. Some of the student codes of conduct were written so long ago, they don't even acknowledge the existence of social media. They don't acknowledge the current world that we live in. They should be revised for the benefit of not just Jewish students, but for the community as a whole. And then they need to be enforced. There need to be repercussions when those rules are violated, and that stands in stark contrast to what we've seen on some campuses where the violation of those rules has actually been rewarded. That's an important step. And universities need, beyond that, they need to be very clear in ensuring, and this is, I'm sure, a conversation that will take place over the course of this day, there needs to be viewpoint diversity on campus. When you allow one group to completely silence another, the harassment and intimidation of Jewish students, of Israeli students, is meant to silence them. And universities have a role to play in ensuring that if they intend the university to live up to its ideals as a place where a free exchange of ideas can actually take place, then you have to actually hear all voices. And you can't allow one group to silence the voices that they disagree with, and in this case, that they violently disagree with. That's an important step that has to be taken, and there's a responsibility, I'll just finish, Ranking Member Neal, with the faculty as well. There are the challenges that exist with the faculty, the way that faculty on some campuses conduct themselves in ways even in violation of the guidelines on academic freedom that the American Academy of University Professors sets out, winds up doing damage again to the ultimate goals of the university, which is to be a place where there can be a free exchange of ideas. That has to be tackled seriously, and this has to be done over not just the coming semester, but this is something that universities need to focus on over the coming years, and it starts with university presidents who set the right tone, who speak with moral clarity, who understand that what's happening at this moment when there are protesters supporting terrorist groups runs contrary to everything about that university campus.
Thank you.
I now recognize Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly thank you to our witnesses here today as well. This committee's jurisdiction is built around the tax code, obviously, and it's important we conduct oversight to ensure entities receiving tax exemptions or credits through the code are following applicable rules. That concept is not unique to educational institutions. For example, I don't really agree with much of the Democrats' stimulus bill from 2022, but they understood what they were doing when they wrote domestic content requirements into their electric vehicle tax credit. We have historically limited who credit unions can serve and how much they can lend to businesses because they are exempt from tax while banks are not. Even popular individual provisions like individual retirement accounts and 529s have rules about what you can and can't do with the funds in exchange for receiving tax deferral or exemption. Colleges and universities shouldn't be treated any differently. They receive their tax-exempt status on the basis of providing quality education in a safe environment. When they fail to do that, we should all be concerned. I'm chilled by what I hear, not just on the news, but comments here today. Professor Davidai, you've spoken publicly about the radical viewpoints taught by specific professors, I believe, at Columbia. For example, it's my understanding that one colleague of yours, known for anti-Israel positions, recently published a controversial article which described the Hamas attacks as, quote, awesome, end quote, and as a, quote, resistance offensive, end quote. I think you've pointed to some of these. But another Columbia professor published a social media post stating, I'm with Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad, end quote. I know that this is not limited to just Columbia. That's certainly my observation. But it's bad enough when students might intimidate other students and the administration would take a dismissive posture. When faculty engages in rhetoric such as this, I am extremely concerned. I find it chilling, absolutely chilling, that this situation is what it is. Professor Davidai, from your perspective, how would you say the spread of these viewpoints from faculty has impacted the student population? And if you could elaborate further than what you've already stated in terms of the actual impact on students.
Thank you so much for this question. So first of all, we have to note that there has been a systematic purging of certain viewpoints from Columbia University and other universities. It used to be the case that students who were interested in engaging in critical thinking could go and listen to the professor you mentioned, Joseph Massad, hear his viewpoints, which I completely disagree with, and then go and sit on a different class with a professor with opposing viewpoints who actually believes that Jews do have a right to exist, and the students will have some balanced point of view. The problem is that throughout 2, 3, or 4 decades, there has been a purge of professors who disagree with people like Professor Massad, Hamid Dabishi, and the sorts. And now students are just not educated, they're indoctrinated. When you are only allowed to listen to one point of view, then you end up either agreeing with that point of view because you didn't get any opposing views, or you drop out of the class. There have been experiences of students that feel like they have to write papers that oppose their own values just to get a passing grade. So I believe that's a huge problem for education.
Right, thank you. Ms. Dror, I want to talk briefly about the 501c3 part of our tax code and that exempt purpose. We could talk probably a long time in addition to the discussion here in terms of tax exempt status and what does that do for students. It certainly doesn't seem to lower the tuition much, but especially when students would feel harassed in the environment where these institutions have massive and generous tax breaks that they take advantage of. What would you say is the impact of students themselves?
Universities are using their federally allocated funds to fund hateful student groups like Students for Justice in Palestine and its fellow organizations that essentially organize and spew hatred. So universities are now using federal funds that they get through, if I'm not mistaken.
Federal funds would be even different than the tax-exempt status that is enjoyed by these institutions. So, but it's resources nonetheless.
They're using their very exorbitant amount of power and wealth to fund anti-American students promoting hatred and anti-Americanism.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So many of the chants and taunts since October 7th have fueled anti-Semitism, and the incidents that you described today are truly outrageous. I've joined one resolution after another, one letter after another to condemn and respond, including the important and very appropriate recommendations of the Anti-Defamation League, such as the Never Again Education Act and the Department of Education's Open Center to Combat Anti-Semitism. At the same time, I took this position not after October 7th, but throughout my life, and particularly on August 12, 2017, condemning those white nationalists that marched through Charlottesville with their torches yelling, "Jews will not replace us." Unlike President Trump, I did not find good people on both sides. Rather, I saw dangerous racists and anti-Semites on one side. Yet Trump could not bring himself to treat neo-Nazis and the KKK any differently than Vladimir Putin. Never a genuine word of criticism. Even today, our colleagues had to push back this very hearing in order to meet with the former president, who very recently said that Jews, like our former colleague Ted Deutch, who don't vote for him, quote, hate their religion and hate Israel. I think we need a broad concept of what anti-Semitism is and that it applies there also. I also reject the opposition and the attacks that have occurred on and off campuses to the very concept of a democratic Jewish state, which I support. There were no Palestinian martyrs on October 7th, only murderers and rapists. Our hope, though, of saving the lives of innocent Palestinian women and children is diminished by every protest that can be discredited as anti-Semitic and every action that drives our neighbors away instead of causing more of them to recognize the true nature of the catastrophe that is ongoing today that results from Netanyahu's indiscriminate bombing and unwillingness to facilitate essential humanitarian aid to the Gazan people. In confronting rising anti-Semitism, we need equal concern about rising Islamophobia and hateful acts against Muslims, blaming the innocent for what they did not cause. I believe in policies and practices that protect all individuals, Jewish and Muslim, from hate and discrimination. This includes robust reporting mechanisms for anti-Semitic and Islamophobic incidents, comprehensive anti-bias training, as you've urged today, and a zero tolerance on hate speech and discrimination. Anti-Semitism should not be weaponized as a way to attack those of us who disagree with the policies of Israel's ultra-right government, and specifically with the self-serving actions of Netanyahu and his partner Ben Gvir. Such misapplication only demeans the term anti-Semitic. And today, one of our Republican witnesses is here to take the misuse of anti-Semitism a step further by arguing that, quote, a main contributor to the new left anti-Semitism is atmospheric, the radical diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI ideology. Such claims not only misconstrue diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also basically pit one minority group against another. DEI responds to decades of systematic exclusion of people of color from higher education in states like mine in Texas. It seeks to create a culture of respect and understanding for all. Both communities of color and Jewish Americans are all too familiar with the very real prejudice that they've endured. Shared mistreatment has often united them to stand up together against injustice. With the University of Texas at Austin yielding to legislative pressure to shutter the Multicultural Engagement Center, we lost a home away from home, as many students describe it. It is a center where, as Congressman Deutch has suggested, there ought to be a place to educate about Jewish history and anti-Semitism. I don't say that every DEI program across the country has been without fault, but we should be finding common ground there. And it is a mystery to me why the Republican leadership here continues to refuse to permit a vote on Congressman Kathy Manning's H.R. 7921, Countering Anti-Semitism Act, to establish a national coordinator to oversee an interagency task force to counter anti-Semitism. It should have been approved long ago. We live in a time here in America and in the Middle East where neither side can appreciate the well-justified pain of the other. Together, we've got to seek to overcome the fear and the pain to promote more understanding and capitalize on the talents of all Americans. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. It's amazing that we think we can have a meeting of the Ways and Means Committee to come together to try to figure out what the heck is wrong with what's going on in the world today. The seeds of hate are sown long before the freshman year. They're sown at home by mothers and fathers, grandmas and grandpas, aunts and uncles and families. When we don't teach our children early on that hate is wrong at any level and in any people at all, I am amazed that we think there's a political answer to a human problem. We can pass all the laws we can. That doesn't mean they can be enforced or that the people will even accept that that's a law that I have to follow. We're having a debate today, a political debate that goes far beyond politics. This is absolutely incredible that we think that somehow these seeds of hate that are sown at a very early age and then fanned as the child grows can be corrected by a law. It goes far deeper than that. I think it's appalling that we think we have to call a committee hearing to address something that's so fundamental in the raising of our children. We have destroyed the nuclear family with different government programs. We've encouraged people to not try to get better, to try to get more understanding, to try to become a better person, and we've tried to substitute a government-funded existence that is the worst thing to do to any human being. Ted, it's good to see you again. I got to tell you, I just lost a really good friend of mine not too long ago. We used to drive to high school together, and he was Jewish, and the things that he had to go through were absolutely appalling to me. We sit here today and think that a law can be passed to outlaw hate. And we know the drivers of most of this stuff that happens at our highest universities, it's funding. My gosh, we can't lose that stream of funding, so let's try to accommodate that. No, what we need to do is quit accommodating the type of behavior that we're seeing taking place, not just here in America, but around the world. It is absolutely appalling that human beings can look at each other and hate each other for something that they believe in. I wish there was a law, and there is a law from a much higher source than men can do on their own. I have no questions of you other than to say, thank you for taking a time out of your life to come here again to talk to people who love to turn in everything into a political answer as opposed to common decency. If it doesn't start at home, you can't expect it to grow. And if it's not supported by mothers and fathers, aunts and uncles, grandmas and grandpas, and neighbors, why do we wonder that we see these things happen by people who are in the highest places of education and say, how can they be so filled with hate? And how can we sit back and think that somehow we're going to pass a law that changes that? The law we need to pass is your mom and dad. It's your responsibility. It is your responsibility. There's no law that can be enacted that can stop this from happening. Recognizing it is one thing. Accepting it is not an alternative. So thank you all for being here. I have no questions of you because we've talked before. We've talked before and things have only gotten worse. And somehow we think it's a fault of a previous administration or somebody who didn't do this or didn't do that. And we say, please, find a mirror and take the longest look you can at the reflection and say, what have I done as an individual to make sure that my children don't grow up hate-filled, but rather thankful for the country they live in and their opportunity to actually make a change or a difference in the world, a positive change. Well, thank you again so much for doing this. I am baffled by our continuance to have meeting after meeting, hearing after hearing, to think, who is it that's responsible for all this hate-filled part of our society? Find a mirror. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Thompson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. You know, in the months since October 7th, communities across our country and in my district have had to grapple with enhanced anti-Semitism. On campuses in my district, Jewish students have been harassed and threatened. There have been bloody handprints left on buildings. There's chants and signs of "from the river to the sea." Even Jewish high school students in my district have hate messages sent to them by fellow students. This is absolutely cruel, it's unacceptable, and it has to stop. I vehemently defend Americans' right to assemble, to free speech, and to protest, and I always will. But when Jewish students are being signaled out, targeted, harassed, made to feel unsafe, that's not peaceful protest. It's not peaceful assembly. Reasonable people can and do disagree about Israel and Palestine. But we should all agree that students should be able to study and to learn free of any harassment, let alone religious bigotry. Along with all my colleagues on this dais, I too believe anti-Semitism is appalling and has no place in our society. Congressman Deutch, good to see you here today. You mentioned that there's things that universities need to do to improve the situation on campuses, and you spoke to that in response to Chairman Neal's questions. But could you talk about the physical security measures that may be needed to ensure a safe and peaceful place from which students can learn?
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. And I don't want to take away from your time, but I just want to acknowledge that the question that Mr. Kelly asked about what can I do individually is a question that I think really all of us need to ask, and I appreciated that. Mr. Thompson, there's as we've seen this dramatic increase in threats to Jewish students on campus, threats of violence since 10/7, the university has a responsibility to meet the potential security needs. It's true in religious and cultural places on campus. It's true in gatherings on campus so that there is adequate security, that they don't have to shut down events in the middle, send people home because they're not equipped with adequate security. It's so that they don't have to cancel an event that was meant to be a public event only to shuffle the participants to an undisclosed location in a significantly smaller number because that's all they're able to help secure. And it means ensuring that the speakers who come through that have the security that they need so that you don't wind up losing the opportunity to hear from Israeli voices and hear from Jewish voices who are told don't come to our campus because it's just not safe for you. There have been now 150, Mr. Marcus confirmed this, more than 150 schools that have open Title VI investigations. The Title VI cases are important. I mentioned earlier, universities should have Title VI offices so that they're starting to focus on these issues, including physical security, in a way to address them directly.
Thank you very much. I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Snyder.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Marcus, if I can turn to you a little bit, and it's a broad question, but I'll set up for later. The protests we're seeing on campus, the professors and scholars coming out to join or even lead changing curriculums in their campuses, is that something new or is this something that we've seen on campuses for a long period of time?
So, Mr. Schneider, we have seen protesters on campus for a long period.
I'm talking about the professors, the academic scholars. For example, with the ASA and other associations supporting anti-Israel positions and rhetoric.
We've seen protests, but they're protests in their protests, and we've seen faculty engaged in protests, but not at this level. Now we have a much greater politicization, a much greater polarization, much greater involvement in faculty, and let's admit it, there's a difference between protesting a war in which one could say that there are, issues of justice. It's very different when you look at a so-called protest that began even before the Israeli Defense Forces encroached into Gaza, a so-called protest that began as soon as the Hamas atrocities became publicized. These are not just protests. These are extremist support for terrorist actions. The fact that faculty are supporting that in many cases, this is unprecedented and shouldn't be compared to prior protest activity.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Schweikert is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Okay, we're going to try to go through a couple things here. First off, and Mr. Chairman, I fear, and I know our scope is tax money, universities, those things. But I am incredibly concerned that the almost evil crazy that I see coming in on my own personal phone, the fact of the matter, and Congressman Deutch would be able to process this, you open up your phones on Monday morning and start having your staff go through your voicemails, and there's hundreds and hundreds of actually burn civil society down, just almost evil. And my fear is much of it is a bot. It's the use of technology. How much of the mind bending from the people who used to have the bumper sticker, it would say coexist, to now it's a bumper sticker of a Palestinian flag with a weapon attached to it. What has snapped here? And my fear, Mr. Chairman, as we do our little piece here on universities and how much of this is foreign influence money and other things falling through the process, Are we capable as members of Congress having a societal discussion of the financiers and generation of hate that seem to be coming in from foreign entities, maybe even from some fairly sick entities in my own country? And it's burning down, the potential of burning down civil society across the world. Congressman Deutch, you won't remember, but years ago, you and I had sort of a side conversation on some of this, and my fear, the use of technology to push anti-Semitism, and that it's a handful of people who bought bots and natural language, chat. How much do you believe of this evil is being pumped into our society and manipulating young people's brains and even other people's brains is being financed from outsiders?
Well, we know, we know a couple of things clearly. We know that state actors are involved in this effort to help divide the people of the United States from one another. We've seen the same thing. This is the playbook that the Russians have used around the world and have done the same thing here. We know that the Iranians and other state actors are also involved. And this is one where I defer to the House and my former colleagues to continue to make sure that that is a focus. We also know, though, when it comes to funding, the questions that are being asked are important, and the effort, the Deterrent Act that seeks to impose penalties for non-compliance with disclosures, I think is important. At the same time, I think that I would just suggest, please.
No, you're going, because you're going exactly where I want. Can you help young persons, older people, people who, that get their news from fringe crazy things here, understand through that disclosure, you're being manipulated, you're being used, these people are trying to exploit you?
Right. I think it's important to remember that while there is a serious effort to do that that's coming from the outside, what they're manipulating is the algorithms of the social media companies. I think we should start by expecting that the social media companies enforce their own rules about the kind of content on their platforms that put Jewish students in particular in recent months in harm's way.
Mr. Chairman, the former congressman sort of went, I wish we as a body could have a more holistic discussion, because today it's anti-Semitism. It's burning down and moving back to a historic evil, and it will tear civil society apart. And look, I have pieces of legislation to try to provide more flexibility for the Religious Institution Security Act, because how many of my shuls actually now have to have armed guards there and things of that nature. I wish we would actually look at a number of these ways we can protect each other, and then we have to have a conversation again. What the hell happened when they're wonderful people, when my leftist neighbor pulled off the coexist bumper sticker and went the other direction? What snapped? I'm not smart enough to understand it, but I'm actually quite worried, not only for my Jewish community, but for my country. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. LaHood is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding this hearing today. I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony here today and your passion. Welcome back, Congressman Deutch. Good to have you here. Since the atrocious terrorist attacks committed by Hamas on October 7th, we've seen a widespread anti-Semitic activity on our college campuses, as has been alluded to today. One estimate reporting a 321% increase from 2022. What's worse, we have seen a complete lack of leadership by university leaders and campus administrators at many institutions, leaving Jewish students, faculty, alumni, and community members without any actual protection or support. As we continue to see this anti-Semitism rage on college campuses, I think it's important to consider the U.S. Department of Education's role here as well. As many of you know, Title VI of the Higher Education Act prohibits discrimination based on national origin and shared ancestry. Among other things, and it's supposed to be enforced by the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, also known as OCR. Unfortunately, OCR too frequently settles these cases with schools through resolution agreements instead of making a final determination about whether Title VI violation actually occurred. As a result, it appears that many schools avoid scrutiny and accountability for their actions by implementing short-term remedial corrective actions as directed by the Department of Education. Mr. Marcus, appreciate your public service. As we look at this ability of the Department of Education and their Office of Civil Rights to enforce Title VI violations, I'm just curious, as we look at the last 8 months and what's gone on in these college campuses, I'm curious what you think, your opinion on whether the Biden administration has done a good job in enforcing Title VI and handling these complaints of anti-Semitism that we've seen across the country.
Thank you, Congressman LaHood. I think that this administration has done some things well with respect to anti-Semitism, especially in outreach, public messaging, and transparency, but the investigations have been extremely slow. The policy formulations have been weak. There have been too few in the way of resolutions, and there have been dismissals that I think are hard to defend. So I would say it has been a mixed bag, and I would also say that you make a good point about the problem that some cases that should lead to a final disposition and perhaps punishments are resolved perhaps prematurely, but in ways that the statute may require, because by statute, OCR must seek a voluntary resolution, and in some cases, that does weaken their response.
Can you give us any examples in the last 8 months where there's been a determination that's been done that will send a deterrent message to this type of behavior by universities?
No, sir. Not in the last 8 months with respect to a university. With respect to the Davidson School, which is K-12 in the last month, perhaps. With respect to the last maybe 16 months, the University of Vermont. So there have been a couple of cases that have sent useful signals, but not enough, not recently enough, and especially not recently with respect to higher education.
Well, I would agree with that. Can you tell me if a proper civil judgment was put in place against a university or a college through the Title VI process, tell me what that would do in terms of sending a message from a financial standpoint and a deterrent message of the consequences for the lack of enforcement.
So monetary judgments can sometimes be available under Title VI with a private lawsuit, but those are expensive, not available to everyone, and time-consuming. Under the OCR process, there are very few instances in which money damages are available. If there were an ability to get money damages, it would presumably provide a nice incentive effect. I think that that would be a useful addition to the process.
Is it your recommendation that we ought to think about statutory changes to make the enforcement mechanism stronger and more robust?
Yes, sir. The process it's slow, it's weak, and I think it would be useful to consider strengthening it, not just for Jewish students, but for all.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses, especially Talia, and for all you've been through. We appreciate your testimony and your passion and commitment. Also, Mr. Chairman, I want to commend, this is not often on the committee do we see unanimity in terms of the forthright concern about anti-Semitism. And some of the compelling testimony and also some of the compelling questions from our colleagues. along the lines of what a number of members have said, I wanted to ask our former colleague, Mr. Deutch, especially because you're so familiar with the process. I would like to submit for the record a report from the Department of Education that shows that the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights has received a record number of discrimination complaints while losing department staff. And so that kind of cuts to the question that Mr. Marcus was asked as well, et cetera, and also plays to your response with regard to the administration. If your budget is cut and you have record number of complaints and we're not receiving the resources and the Department of Education isn't able to meet these critical cases, what happens, especially when cases are put forward and they're left open for months? Mr. Deutch, could you respond to that?
Sure. First, just to follow up on Mr. Marcus's point, I think, in your exchange with Mr. LaHood, I think it's really important for the department to be very clear about what the potential repercussions are for universities, so that everyone understands, what the result of these cases could be, where these could lead. The fact that they're now, it's a step forward, that they're now disclosing the number of cases, I think it's really important to be clear about what the penalties are. And then at the same time, the good news is there are so many good news, bad news. Because of the situation we're in, there's a crisis. But they're stepping up to meet the crisis and launching these investigations. The problem is there aren't sufficient investigators. There aren't enough resources. I agree with Mr. Marcus that it's slow. The workload for each of the investigators almost guarantees that. They need additional funding so that you can bulk up the staff at this moment when these more investigators will mean a greater and a faster response.
Thank you. I agree with Mr. Marcus as well with regard to that, and I also agree that there's no one on this committee on this issue that has as much passion as Mr. Schneider, and I will yield to him my remaining time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm going to pick up where I left off. I asked Mr. Marcus about what he'd seen in the past. Professor Davidai, you've kind of been outspoken and you've experienced it. And first, let me apologize. I conflated Columbia with Cornell. I know, Talia, you graduated from Cornell, as did you, Professor Davidai, so, but you're at Columbia now. And we saw this almost with a flip of a switch on October 7th, the protests come out. Can you touch a little bit on what you saw on October 7th and 8th on Columbia, as far as what the protests, including from professors, look like?
Yeah, actually, I disagree with the premise. This was not a switch that changed. This is something that has been for decades. There's been a movie in 2004 called Columbia Unbecoming about the anti-Semitic professors, many who I have mentioned in my testimony. Columbia has known about this and done nothing about that. You asked about protests before. Well, in 2005, or starting in 2005, Professor George Saliba used to cancel classes so his students can attend anti-Israel protests. What we have seen is not a switch, it's just an increase in the vehemence. And it actually points to the question Mr. Schweikart asked of what snapped. Nothing snapped. If you look around, the vast majority of your colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, are not here. They didn't see this as a top priority. So their constituents and the students around the country, they see that anti-Semitism, support for terrorism, is not a priority for the House. So why wouldn't they go and protest?
Okay, thank you. I am going to challenge you, though.
Yeah.
We have oftentimes 2, 3 hearings all at the same time. There's
Exactly.
a budget hearing going on as we're talking now.
That's why I said a priority. I didn't say they don't want to be here. They have other priorities.
It's not a matter of priority. We come, we go, people will be here. You'll see them coming throughout this. This is a priority. That's why we have this hearing. It is a priority. That's why we have had legislation come to the floor. And we need to make sure it stays a priority. We elevate it. And as Mr. Larson said, this is something that on both sides of the aisle, in this committee, Republicans and Democrats are focused on.
I respectfully disagree. I have to say, the priorities are, the top priority is where you show up, and this is not the top priority. It's a second, third, or fourth priority.
Mr. Davidai, I completely agree with you. I believe members of this committee were asked to serve on this committee, and they should be present, and it's all about priorities. We're busy people, but this is the most important committee in Congress, and that is why people should be in their seats. Dr. Winstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to give a heartfelt thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. You've been through a lot. And before I begin, I'd like to submit a statement for the record on behalf of my good friend, Dr. Murphy, who could not attend the hearing today due to a personal medical issue. Dr. Murphy's a former member of the Board of Trustees at Davidson College, so he has firsthand knowledge of the seismic shift we are seeing on college campuses today. And frankly, I find it disheartening and profoundly disappointing that we are all here once again, forced to reckon with this virulent anti-Semitism that has only grown worse since we last convened in November in the wake of the October 7 attacks. It's very disappointing. You know, what I see happening on our college campuses, to me, is anti-American, it's anti-Jewish, it's anti-freedom, and to me, these are nothing more. Some of these campuses have become nothing more than treasonous cells and terrorist cells. Mr. Dror, you've been terrorized, and so have many others. I don't know what people are supposed to do for a college education for their kids today. You know, maybe we can go to homeschooling for college. I don't know where we're supposed to go. We need to consider where we allow our tax dollars to go. Our president wants to pay off student loans, even for those that hate America. And it's the very taxpayers whose money it would take to do so. What are we doing? You know, it's not just universities. It's throughout. It's in sports. It's everywhere else. I had a NFL running back one time get in my face that I haven't done enough to promote DEI. I didn't see him promoting DEI for his offensive line. It was merit-based, wasn't it? And though many institutions, their intentions may be good, and when we see this in professional sports, you know, not all teams are playing along with the negativity. What I'd much rather see in end zones today is maybe something as simple as love your neighbor. That seems to me to cover it all, and we'd be much better off. So I think about what can we do here in this body? Besides greater awareness, that only goes so far. Professor, you just alluded to that. It's very difficult. But I will say this, and I allow any one of you to answer the question. What would happen if we cut off federal funds to any university that was allowing these types of things to go on their campuses?
So I would say that even before you cut it off, their knees will start shaking and change will happen. We have to remember Columbia University is the largest private landlord in New York City, and it is a tax-exempt largest private landlord. They own the land of Rockefeller Center. They own most of Morningside Heights and many of the buildings in Harlem. You know, if only the thought of losing that tax exemption would pass through their minds, you would see no more anti-Semitism. You won't see any misdoing anything on campus because these universities, and I've spent a lot of time in these universities, they're not elite universities, they're expensive universities. All they care about is money and PR. And if you start playing with that, things will change.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I couldn't agree more, and I would like to actually take this moment to thank Mr. Smith for his investigation. Every single positive action I've seen out of Cornell in the past 7 months have been the result of the pressure of this committee. I have a lot to be grateful for, but I do think that you will see tangible results when you place pressure on these universities that think that they are allergic to any form of punishment.
May I add one thing? Thank you for the question. I think the premise behind the tax exemption is that these are institutions that are organized and operated exclusively for educational purposes. Universities don't look today what they looked like 50 years ago. They have $4, $5, $6 billion budgets. They manage wealth equivalent to a large hedge fund. They sell a lavish college experience, luxury dorms, gourmet food, subsidized by taxpayers. They operate multi-million or billion-dollar research labs. They hire teams of lobbyists. Some have hundreds of millions in foreign revenue. They run DEI programs that understand their purpose as being to re-engineer American society. That's a political purpose. That is not an educative function. Elite universities are simply no longer driven by truth-seeking or education as their guiding ethos.
Anyone else? Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Ferguson.
Thanks, Chairman Smith, and thanks to each of you for being here. I want you to think about time in our nation's history when we actually had universities that would discriminate against African Americans on admissions policies. How horrible do we think that that was and is and should never happen again? And I'll take you back to the case of the United States versus Bob Jones University, where because of their racially discriminatory policies, their tax-exempt status was removed. And in studying the case, and keep in mind, I'm a dentist playing lawyer up here, so you'll have to excuse my very simplistic method here. But it seems that we're in very similar territory right now, where you have universities that are clearly violating the civil rights of its students. And Honorable Marcus, could you weigh in on, do you think that there's similarities in the violation of student civil rights today that is like what happened with Bob Jones University? And do you think that that should be reason for the IRS to revoke the tax-exempt status of these universities that continue to violate the civil rights of their students?
Congressman Ferguson, you have raised an important issue. I don't think we need to compare the discrimination that Jewish students face to those of African Americans to realize that there is a problem, and a problem that's not being taken seriously enough. Universities are responding to OCR investigations. They are responding to lawsuits. However, most universities are virtually addicted to federal funding and tax exemption. If any university was seriously threatened with either one of them, it would create a massive change within both that university and also its peers around the country. Right now, we don't have that sort of incentive effect. We don't have the sort of action that you described with respect to Bob Jones University. But if we had that sort of forcefulness, it would get a very different sort of reaction than what we've been seeing.
So, look, I'm pragmatic and I'm a political realist. And we could go through the process of writing legislation and passing laws. I don't know that how many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would move to advance this, particularly in the U.S. Senate. And I have really no hope that the current administration would sign it into law, much less enforce it. However, there is precedent to do this administratively with the IRS. And it seems to me that a very similar type of environment exists here. And I'm just wondering when student groups or different advocacy groups would actually look at suing these universities to have their tax-exempt status removed for violation of the Civil Rights Act. In addition to that, not only should the IRS look at it administratively following their guidelines from previous cases, but I think they should even think about introducing not only removing the tax-exempt status, but possibly a financial penalty as well. If these schools are going to receive federal funds And if they don't do that, there should be some sort of clawback or even some sort of penalty. Professor, could you speak to that?
Yeah, I really appreciate your pragmatism. Like you, I don't like big ideas that are not rooted in reality. So I would say the most pragmatic thing is for Americans to understand what they are funding, right? Like we talk about universities as this broad thing. and-
Professor, I mean, I think this committee and our chairman have done a great job of really looking at that piece of it. But in the end, there's got to be a mechanism or a lever that can be pulled that has a profound effect on their behavior. And it seems to me, and Doctor, if you could weigh in on this very quickly, that removal of the tax exempt status, as it has been, and that tool has been used in the past by the IRS, it seems like that would be a very effective tool and also a financial penalty for the violation of student rights and while they're receiving
Right,
federal
so
funds.
one
Professor,
thing-
do you mind if I let Dr.
Because I would just say, sorry, but one thing that I would say, once the university's budgets get hurt, this will be affecting the professor's budget. And once the professor's salaries and research budgets get hurt, they will upkeep the norms and push out the hateful professors from amidst them.
So, very quickly, Mr. Chairman, do you mind if we respond?
Proceed quickly.
So my opinion is that only strong financial incentives will change behavior. One of the things we've observed in the last 8 months is that universities that don't have tremendous amounts of resources, they don't have this problem. And the reason they don't have this problem is because they don't have money to waste on highly ideological, divisive programs. They focus on educating. And so if we constrain the funding, universities will have to make choices, and some of them will redirect their resources to their educational mission.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Pascrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for putting us together this morning on this very important topic. Each witness was excellent, I thought. And I think, Mr. Chairman, it's good to point out the fact that some of our brothers and sisters have left. They probably have other assignments. But don't forget, we were a half hour late. We were a half hour late starting the committee to begin with, and I'm not trying to be the wise guy, but what's fair is fair here. The children are listening. Don't think they're not listening. So we could compare notes since October the 7th to talk about how our families have been put in jeopardy, perhaps, to fill a book. But we must protect also what I would call